Good morning. This is the European History Lecture for Monday, December 7th, 2020. Yesterday, December the 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. On the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, over 3,000 Americans were killed. The attack was a sneak attack while Japanese diplomats were negotiating with the American government. Their carrier force moved north of Hawaii, and with hundreds of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, they destroyed the American Pacific Fleet's battle force, that is, all of our battleships, as well as many of the other ships in harbor. This was done without a declaration of war. The Japanese began all their modern wars, with China in 1894, with Russia in 1904, and with Germany, I think in 14, although they may have had a declaration then. But the other two were definitely without declaration of wars. They were launched with sneak attacks. So we shouldn't have been that surprised. Now, the truth is, the Japanese government was trying to play it very coy, and they sent a last minute dispatch by secret code to their delegation in Washington to be delivered by a very particular time, Washington Eastern Standard Time. And, well, the people in the embassy couldn't decode it quickly enough, is the story. So the declaration of war came several hours after the Pacific Fleet was destroyed. Before that, the American people were divided on the issue of whether or not to get involved in the war. The war in Asia had begun in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. The war in Europe had begun in 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland. To this point, about half the American people were part of the so-called America First Party of Charles Lindbergh, which was for peace at any price, to stay out of another war, to avoid another bloodletting in the trenches. President Roosevelt had been giving unofficial aid to the British for some time, but that aid was short of war because President Roosevelt understood both the threat of the Japanese and the Germans to the United States long term. Better to fight with an ally in Britain than to fight 5 years from now without an ally alone and without having an air base proximate to Western Europe. But most of the American people were unaware of this. They were unaware that the U.S. Navy was, in fact, in a shooting war with the Germans 5 months before the Pearl Harbor attack. What Americans did know is that we were sneak attacked by the Japanese. The admiral in the Japanese Navy, Isoriku Yamamoto, who planned the attack, who knew the United States, who had lived here as a naval attaché, was a good poker player, had predicted that if they went to war with us, they'd have the first 6 months without any trouble at all. But once the American industrial capacity, see, at that point we built everything for the world, kicked in, they would be in serious trouble. He was overridden. The war cabinet under General Hideki Tojo insisted on war as a response to an American oil embargo, which was a response to the Japanese occupation of French Indochina. That includes Vietnam. You'll learn a lot more about this when we do the 20th century. After the attack, Yamamoto famously said that I'm afraid all we have done is awakened a sleeping dragon, filled it with a terrible resolve. The Japanese wouldn't stop fighting. They lost the capacity to win World War II in June of 1942 at the Battle of Midway. They lost the ability to project power by the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944, yet they kept fighting more intensely as we got closer to the home islands. Why? Because the Japanese nation has one purpose: to protect its God Emperor and to obey it. And the closer we came to damaging Tokyo, and we burned Tokyo to the ground, we killed more Japanese in Tokyo than in either atom bomb attack with napalm. We did it. But we didn't kill the emperor. We didn't bomb the palace. We were very careful about that. It took not one, but 2 atom bombs to shock the Japanese out of their determination to die fighting as a nation, as a race of people, as a distinct culture. We will talk about these things as we get closer. The analogous moment in American history to Pearl Harbor, where my father-in-law lost several friends in those battleships. For him, Pearl Harbor Day was very, very personal, and he was World War II generation. He was going to be a part of the invasion of Japan. He and my mother-in-law were both going to be part of that. She was a Navy nurse. He was a Navy officer going to command a landing craft. The life expectancy of those guys was not very long. They were both saved by the atom bombs. The analogous moment was September the 11th, 2001, when again, just over 3,000 Americans were killed in an unprovoked attack. However, there are some differences. Pearl Harbor, at least, was a military target. 9/11, they picked civilians and office buildings as their targets to spread the maximal amount of terror and have the minimal fighting back. The Japanese at least eventually did declare war, and they fought war in a conventional fashion. Uniforms, battleships, aircraft, tanks. The war on terror is fought by gullible teenagers who are ready to die right here, right now, to kill enemies of the faith for God. I admire the dedication, but the cynical old men who ordered those young people into battle to commit suicide are among the evilest people on this earth. And they are given succor and support by the government of Iran, by the government that used to be in Afghanistan, that now hides out in Pakistan, by various factions in the Syrian civil war, and therefore they are given aid and protection by the Russians under Vladimir Putin and the Chinese under Xi Jinping. We are still fighting the war on terror, with less intensity than World War II, but at times with more intensity than the Cold War. But most Americans forget. It is our doom as a free people that we forget. Never forget. Never forget. December 7th, 1941, September the 11th, 2001, were those other moments when a peaceful people suddenly realizes that there are those in this world who hate us enough to commit acts of barbarism, terror, and war against us, because there are. Happy Pearl Harbor Day. Thoughts or questions from anyone before we begin the lecture? You have them. Okay. Can I ask, please, for a volunteer to quietly hand out those things that are yours? Thanks, Sam. Anyone who's not here in the room, just leave it, put it on the back here. Thank you for doing that as we go. Okay. We got through what we did last week, which is to talk about the philosophical enlightenment. The philosophical enlightenment produces something special in British North America. The class of middle-class businessmen and southern planters. Middle-class businessmen in the north and south, planters in the south, plantation owners, became devotees of John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, and others. The notion of the rights of man, inalienable rights. And at the same time, these colonials became increasingly aware that under mercantilism, they were being treated as second-class citizens. They were no longer fully permitted to exercise the rights that Englishmen have traditionally had as free men under the king. There's a history behind this. The French and the British fight a series of wars for control of the seas, for dominance in Europe, and for control of the colonial world in India, in the Americas, in the Caribbean, and elsewhere. The biggest of these, the real First World War, the First Worldwide War, is the 7 Years' War, which in the United States and in American history is called the last of the French and Indian Wars. But in this 7 Years' War, the colonials in America saw a lot of combat. French Algonquin allies raided not only the territory of English colonials, but of our Iroquois allies. With the help of the Iroquois, Englishmen like George Washington took part in the Siege of Quebec and the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where the French army in North America under Montcalm is defeated by General Wolfe. Washington was a young English officer, a colonial English officer from Virginia. Washington had also gotten his first battlefield command earlier in the war to capture the French fort Duquesne at the confluence of the Monongahela rivers and I think the Ohio River. In any case, it's where modern Pittsburgh is now. He renamed Fort Duquesne Fort Pitt, but Fort Pitt was captured by the French and he was forced to sling arms and retreat. Not an auspicious beginning to General Washington, future General Washington's career. After the 7 Years' War, thank you, sir, the British government, again, according to mercantile theory, thought that it was about time that the colonies started paying off. The British had spent beaucoup coin on the war in North America. They had built fleets and armies to fight here. And so they wanted to get some money back. First off, the British did not want their colonials stirring up the Iroquois or other Indian allies. So they restricted settlement east of the Appalachian Mountains, despite the fact that Pittsburgh is west of the Appalachians. And the Kentucky territory, which had already begun being settled by English colonials, was also west of the Appalachians. This annoyed the colonials. They thought that they should spread westward wherever and however they could into the lands of the barbarous Indians. It's their perspective. The British didn't let them. Number two, mercantile restrictions got harsher. It became more and more difficult for American colonials to trade freely with anyone other than the appointed British merchants who charged through the nose. Number three, the British started a series of new attempts to gather revenue from British North American colonials, including the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, what the colonials called the Intolerable Act, duties on tea, and other measures designed to tax colonials and squeeze more money out of the British North American colonies. All of these things riled up the colonials. They said that you can't tax us without giving us a voice in Parliament. The response of the English government in London was, as Englishmen, you already have representatives in Parliament. No, we don't have separate representatives for the colonies in North America, but we don't need them. You as Englishmen are represented by your relatives in England who vote for Parliament and the House of Commons. This did not please the colonials. In an act of refusal, several Bostonians, dressed up as Indians, stormed aboard British merchantmen in Boston Harbor, took control of the vessels, and dumped out the cargoes of tea that were going to be taxed. The statement that was made by that event was that we would rather the sharks drink the tea than pay any tax for English tea. This is where America's love affair with coffee began. Finally, as some of the colonials in the Sons of Liberty become more and more provocative, the British fight back. And in the so-called Boston Massacre and the shot heard around the world, British soldiers used naked force to try to put the colonials back into their place. Ultimately, this leads to colonial militias at Lexington and Concord fighting against the British forces marching out of Boston. At Bunker Hill, which is actually Breed's Hill, the American commander orders, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes." And it's on. The American Revolution and Thomas Jefferson on 2nd July, 1776, his declaration is approved by the Continental Congress, and it's published 2 days later, July 4th. And it's labeled July 4th for the publication date. Now, if you look at Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, it is absolutely steeped in the language of the Enlightenment. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That has to do with looking at natural law, like a natural philosopher. That all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator. So this is a general reference to deism, and it also applies to Christianity. It references that we are created with certain attributes and with certain inalienable rights. That all men are created equal. That God did not make a species of human being called an aristocrat and another species of human being called a peasant, and the aristocrat is superior in every way and should rule over the peasant. This is not what Jefferson is asserting. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, rights you cannot separate rightly from a person, not without due process of law. We talked about this last week. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which by pursuit of happiness, Jefferson means property. He then goes to argue that the British government has violated these rights again and again, and thus when in the course of human affairs it becomes necessary for one people to break the bonds that it had once with another people, it is reasonable to expect that they will explain why, and that's the reason for the Declaration. So, using Enlightenment terms, Jefferson talks about how the English or the British government, under Lord North in particular, who was the Prime Minister during the worst of it, during the early Revolution, violated the natural and inalienable rights of the British colonials, and thus provoked this political revolution. The rebellion in British North America was serious. Why do you think it matters that John Hancock wrote his name so darn big on the Declaration of Independence? It was because anyone who put pen to paper and put their name on that thing was signing their own death warrant if they lost. There was nowhere they could run or hide. They would be hunted down and they would be killed as traitors. They would be strung up, hanged by the neck until dead. Their families would be ruined. Any connections that they had gone. Their property would be appropriated. So this is not something for the faint of heart. This is crossing the Rubicon. The die is cast. I will either have victory or I will have death. This is Cortez burning his ships. Those men signing the Declaration of Independence. John Hancock, biggest and tallest of them all. But it's a political revolution. And you need to understand what a political revolution is, because what's going to happen later in France is not. A political revolution is a revolution where the society that was before the war persists largely intact after the war, that the society that existed before the war persists largely intact after the war, that the society that persists before the war existed before the war persists largely intact after the war. But the political system changes, but the government changes, but the government changes, comma, but the government changes. A political revolution is where the society that existed before the war largely persists intact after the war, comma, but the government changes. So after the revolution, after Hamilton the musical, at least the revolutionary part of it, up through the Battle of Yorktown, are the people in Boston that were businessmen and innkeepers still businessmen and innkeepers? Yes, they are. Paul Revere, who was a silversmith, tried his hand at commanding a colonial expedition, and it was a bleeping disaster. He's still a hero of the revolution. He went back to silversmithing. Why? Because he was a lousy commander. But he was great at writing and calling and saying the British are coming, and he was a patriot. He just didn't have the head for command. Not everyone does. Command in war is a very special talent. Not everyone has it. But others came to the fore, like George Washington, Benedict Arnold, several Lees of Virginia, and Hamilton himself. One of the great tragedies of the American Revolution was the competition between various aides of General Washington, trying to become Washington's chief aide, chief general, the second most important colonial after Washington. And the competition was so fierce and so nastily political and so connected, wrapped up with politics within the Continental Congress, that ultimately Benedict Arnold, who saved this country at the Battle of Valcour Island, which set the stage for a year later for the Battle of Saratoga, which is the United States, which is the 13 colonies, the Continental Congress, the United States' first victory over the British. Arnold makes that possible. Arnold is a key figure early in the Revolution, but he doesn't think that he's being treated well. He thinks that he's being overlooked. So ultimately, he's put in command of West Point, a key fortress on the Hudson River, and he makes an agreement with the British Major Andre to sell out West Point. He escapes and lives the rest of his life in England, despised man even by the English, because the English like a good fight, and they don't like it when somebody betrays their own side, especially for money or for ego. So after the American Revolution, are the people who were at the bottom in colonial America still at the bottom? Basically, yeah. Are the people who were at the top in colonial America still there? Basically, yeah. The Tories, the sympathizers with Britain, are all gone. They leave for New Brunswick, Canada, and elsewhere. But in general terms, the social order that exists in the colonies is the same after the war as before, except there's no more British government. That's the difference. We are now self-governing states in a union of some kind, and that union is still to be developed. There's the Articles of Confederation that are too weak, and then we established in the mid-1780s the U.S. Constitution, which is like Baby Bear's bed. It's just strong enough to keep us a strong country, but it's weak enough to keep the government from becoming too powerful and scaring us and overwhelming us and enslaving us. Because a government that can give you anything you want is a government that can take anything you have. And our founders did not want that. One of the reasons why we have the Second Amendment in the Constitution, the right to keep and bear arms. The right is not to go hunting, and it's not even to protect yourself from crime. The Second Amendment is there in case our government becomes tyrannical, so that we can fight to protect ourselves from our own government, just like the founding fathers had to. Hopefully, though, we won't have to. They set up a constitution that can be amended and where a new constitutional convention can be called. We shouldn't need to have to fight a civil war or a revolution. Yet, in the 1860s, we end up fighting a civil war over slavery and whether people have the right to secede or not. And right now, I'll tell you, this country in spirit is closer to a civil war than it's been since the 1860s. And that scares the hell out of me. You've got the urban coastal regions that are embracing the idea of socialism without any reference to the dark and bloody history of that ideal. And the inland and rural regions of the country remain effectively traditional, constitutional, limited government, non-socialistic, and these ideas don't mix. They're like oil and water. And that is still yet to be determined how things are going to resolve. It's one of the reasons why this past election was and is so contentious. Because it's not just like, well, no big deal if Trump gets a second term. No big deal if Biden comes in. Because, they can only do so much. Oh no, there are people who are actually talking about replacing constitutional republic with some variant of a social democracy. That is not what America has been. A lot of people don't like that idea. Other people do. So, we're divided. In any event, though, one of the reasons for this is that in the colonial society there were no lords and no peasants, or almost no lords and almost no peasants. The closest we have to peasants are slaves and indentured servants. The slaves are not from European society, and therefore they are not considered fully human by the slave owners anyway. Indentured servants are European, but they are only temporarily in service, and then they earn their freedom and they go and be free. What you have in the Americas is basically working class and middle class. Working class are people who work for a living, as blacksmiths, craftsmen, carpenters. And middle class people also work for a living. They just tend to own the businesses they work in, print shops, whatever. There aren't many super upper, super lower class people. And in the colonies, you can have a Ben Franklin story. I hope some of you from elementary school learned enough about Benjamin Franklin to know what is interesting about him. He arrives from England in Philadelphia with a few pennies in his pocket. He's a nobody with nothing. 20 years later, he is one of the most famous men, not only in the British colonies, but in all the world. He's a famous writer and publisher, thinker, and revolutionary. He produces one of the United States' first and greatest almanac, Poor Richard's Almanac, and he becomes America's ambassador to the Kingdom of France during the Revolution, helping us get money from the French. So the society is largely a society of self-made men where if you work hard, you have a chance of really succeeding. And if you don't like it here, you can go out to the Kentucky Territory or somewhere else in the wilderness, fight the Indians, and if you live, maybe make a home. It's a political revolution. A social revolution is very different. A social revolution is where the goal of the revolution is to upend society. A social revolution is where the goal of the revolution is to upend society. I am saying this so you can write it down. It is where the goal of the revolution is to upend the society. To destroy the old social order. To destroy the old hierarchy, the old system of wealth and poverty. And the ideal is always there that after destroying the old hierarchy and the old social order, a new, equal, more perfected, utopian-type social order would take its place. This is the dream touted by French revolutionaries, and it is the dream touted since the 1840s by Marxists, communists, and other utopian revolutionaries, as well as fascists and National Socialists, who are different variants. They are all utopian. They all believe that you've got to destroy the old world, kill the past, and then you can replace it with a new utopian world. It has been tried dozens and dozens of times on every continent in this world except Antarctica. And it produces one thing very reliably: dead civilians, killed by their own government in peacetime. For some reason, and we'll explore that when we go through the 19th century, social revolution has never worked. It has never come close to working. What it almost always does, in addition to producing lots and lots of dead bodies, is you end up with a new hierarchy and a new social order, more oppressive and more rigid than the old one. But simply with new people in charge and the old people either executed or on the bottom. When I say upending, I mean actual inversion. And we will talk about all of this. But the social revolutionaries get an A+ for inspiring idealistic young people who think, why can't we make a better world? Why can't we change human nature? Why can't we make a more utopian society? Maybe we won't get completely there, but isn't it worth trying? Really? Isn't it worth trying? So the social revolutionaries certainly inspire a lot of people, because their payoff, if they could ever produce it, is so much greater than a political revolution, where you simply change the government, but not society. Now, social revolutions tend to be more common in more developed societies. In other words, in societies that have a big, strong upper class of aristocrats or bureaucrats or whatever, and a really big lower class of peasants, serfs, slaves, or just people at the bottom, and a relatively small set of working class and middle class people sandwiched between them. Social revolution appeals more in these more mature societies because there are simply more people at the bottom. And if you can alight them with envy, if you can tell them that, no, they don't have to be poor. The only reason we have poverty is because of the distribution of wealth. So what we'll do is we'll simply redistribute it. We'll take from the people who've earned the wealth and whose families have earned wealth and status over time, and we, the party, we, the revolution, will give it to you who've never earned any of it. But in the name of equality, you will now have a bunch of stuff that you didn't have before. And you're no longer at the bottom of the social order, after all, because the revolution is being made in the name of the people. And who is the people more than the lower classes? So there's appeal to envy and vanity and a bunch of other things that give social revolutionaries the muscle of many people in the lower orders on the streets and in the countryside. Social revolution is what happens in Cuba under the communists in 1959. It's what happens in Korea after World War II. It's what happens in China with the victory of the communists in the Chinese Civil War in 1949. It's what happens in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. It is attempted several times in the 19th century, and its first full-scale eruption, the first appearance of a genuinely thoroughgoing social revolution, is in France in 1789. And basically for the next 26 years. So now we're moving into the social revolution that is in France. And we're going to start out with a reminder of geography and climate. Yes, Jack.
What was the date you said it started?
1789. 1789. And it goes on until Napoleon's defeat in 1815 in one form or another. So that, I think, is 26 years. I don't believe in the dogma of man-made climate change. Many scientists don't believe in the dogma of man-made climate change. And there are several bits of evidence that demonstrate proof that certain scientists have suppressed information and censored information that is critical of theories of man made climate change. Whenever science and a political faction get too cozy with one another, I would recommend opening your eyes and looking closely at it. Because there is no the science that proves that man made climate change exists. There are a bunch of data points that are taken largely out of context. And it's funny because the very same solution that is touted for man made climate change, in other words, a global socialism where human behavior is tightly regulated so that we don't produce too many greenhouse gases, and so forth. That same thing, a global socialism with where human activity is tightly regulated, is the exact same solution to the problems of poverty, as explained by Karl Marx and the communists 100 years before. Isn't it funny that all we have to do is give up our freedom and let a government run everything in our lives? And if we do that, not only will we end poverty and have an equality utopia, but we will also heal the world and redirect the climate into a nicer, happier, more wonderful heavenly light. No, I don't believe it. It is way too pat. It is way too simple. And the fact that people react the same way that priests reacted when Galileo said, hey, the sun is not orbiting the earth is orbiting the sun. The same sort of close ranks, bring in the Inquisition, put people to the torture, and force them to recant is done today with anyone who publicly opposes the dogma of man made climate change. I use this as a preface to remind you of who I am. I am telling you the global climate does change. It just changes because of a variety of very complex natural factors. In the late 1100s, the global climate, and 1200s, the global climate cools. It is what's called the Little Ice Age. We've talked about this. There are several years without a summer. There are a few volcanoes. There are changes in warm water ocean currents. All of these things account for it. And remember, our global climate has been unstable since North and South America kissed, cutting off that equatorial warm water current, and since the seaway between Africa and Eurasia was closed by the rising Middle Eastern landmass. Since then, the world has been in a phase of ice age, not ice age, ice age, not ice age. And we are living in an interglacial period. What that means is, sooner or later, there's going to be another ice age. Sooner or later. It's just a question of when, unless something happens like a global thermonuclear war, which tends to increase the temperature for a brief period, and then it will darken the skies for years or centuries, and that will tend to cool the world's climate. In any event, so long as the global equatorial warm water current is disrupted, the world's climate's going to be unsteady. Well, one of the results of the cooling of the world is that global temperatures reduced by about 10 or 15 Fahrenheit degrees. Now you might say, big deal, 10 or 15 degrees, I can take that without even sweating. 10 or 15 Fahrenheit degrees on a global scale, if you are engaged in subsistence agriculture, brings mass starvation. And that's what happens. One of the results of the Little Ice Age is it stirs up the Mongols and the other tribes in Central Asia because that's one of the first areas to become significantly colder. And what happens when Genghis Khan rides out of Mongolia at the head of an army? Oh, the conquest of China, North India, Central Asia, Russia, half the Middle East, or a third of the Middle East anyway, and almost Europe. That's all. And almost Japan. That's all. Not much. Just the conquest of everything from Hungary to Honshu. There's little things like that. Well, in addition, the Little Ice Age is one of the things that encourages the spread of ailments like the Black Plague, which kills between a third and two-thirds of all Europeans over a broad period of time as it comes and goes, as plagues will do. but it brings about enough starvation to inspire werewolf myths. Have I told you how? I think I have, but I'll summarize. You end up with a year without a significant summer. And people in Europe in the Middle Ages and late Middle Ages and early modern times relied upon seed grains like wheat and rye and barley. Long, stalky grass with little tiny seeds waving in the wind, just waiting to get frost killed. Now, with the Columbian Exchange, Europe has an answer to this. Because when there isn't enough grain, the people go up into the woods and into the hills and they strip everything that they can eat, including bark, including some kinds of grass. Now, what does this do? It disturbs the ecosystem in those areas. Then the humans run out of food. And they end up basically doing what starving people do, which is waiting until what they've put in the ground grows to the extent they can have any more food, and they sort of lower their activity level, and they end up lying around a lot inside their huts, which don't really have good doors. Well, with the ecosystem in the hills and woods disturbed, guess who comes down out of the hills and woods? The apex predators, who no longer have food. Because their food, plant eaters, no longer have food to eat because the humans have disturbed everything. And they end up getting eaten, and then there's no more food for the apex predators. So the wolves come into the settlements. And as people are too weak to drive them off after a while, they are emboldened more and more. There you are, lying with your family in your peasant hut. You hear outside wolves going through your garbage pile. Your dogs and cats are long gone. You've either eaten them or they've fled. And then they're sniffing around the door. And Uncle Ed's closest to the door, and everyone starts beating and yelling, and the wolves at first go away. But after a while, you get weaker, and the wolves get bolder as they get more hungry. And soon you see one of them dragging Uncle Ed off by the ankle. Maybe you drive the wolf off at that moment, but Uncle Ed's bleeding. And who here has the energy to really heal him? And Uncle Ed certainly doesn't have the nutrients in his blood system to heal himself in any significant way. Eventually, they're going to take Uncle Ed and anyone else they want while you lie there helpless. What a horror show. And that happened. There are reasons for the Red Riding Hood myth, for the Red Riding Hood myths that Europeans tell. It's not American timber wolves that used to eat people. It's wolves in the hungry times in Europe. And the Little Ice Age makes all of this worse. However, out of the Columbian Exchange comes a heroic tuber from the Andes. Can anyone guess? Just say it. 3, 2, 1.
Potato.
Potato! The heroic potato. You call him Mr. Potato, or maybe Ms. Potato. Now, if you want to be all equal and stuff. And in England and in Ireland and in Germany and in Poland, people start planting potatoes in place of or in addition to their seed grains. Potatoes are where vodka comes from in Russia and Poland. So, why are potatoes better? They're not proof against disease. I mean, the Irish potato famine was caused by a plant disease that turned the potatoes into mush. But in general terms, it's a tuber. It's a root. It's shielded underground from the vicissitudes of hot and cold, wet and dry. It has a much greater chance of surviving an early frost kill than does the grassy little tiny wheat grains. Also, it's big and meaty, if you know what I mean. You know, potatoes are thick. If they take damage on the surface, they still could be 7/8 healthy to eat. Potatoes alleviate the cycle of famine significantly in every European country except France, because the French Love their bread. They still do. Baguette. Croissant. They're not going to eat something that pigs eat that comes out of the ground, not in large numbers. So while potatoes do marginally enter French cuisine and French agriculture in the 1700s, for the most part, no. So the agricultural revolutions, which Jethro Tull and others initiate, is helped by the importation and growth of various potatoes, except in France, which is going to retain its cycles of famine. Now, even at the best of times in subsistence agriculture, you've got a time in the spring and a time in the late summer, which are hungry times. Before the winter wheat matures enough to harvest, in the springtime, you got a week or so of maybe two. And in the late summer, you've got basically from mid August to mid September, depending upon where and when you are, about a month of time where you're on short rations and then there's nothing to eat. And medieval carvings show people with the bulbous bellies that indicate starvation. No, these men did not suddenly become pregnant. And no, these starving men are not fat. It's like looking at little Ethiopian children in hunger videos. Why do they have that? You remember? I think I've told you this, but if not, I'll tell you again. Does anyone know why the bellies get bulbous with people who are starving? Distended, stretched? It's because the human body is intended to have certain mass pass through your digestive tract every day. Food, water. If you don't have sufficient food passing through your digestive tract, and especially if you're also short on clean water, what will happen is that gas will build up that normally would be passed through your system as flatulence or as burping as the food moves through and displaces the gas. But without that, the gas builds and builds and builds. It's quite painful, from what I've heard. This is not gas, this is fat. But there are people who look bigger than I do. They have not eaten a decent meal in weeks. And it's basically as taut as a drum. You could play a tattoo, which is a drum roll, on somebody's belly. Of course, they'll kill you when they get strong again, because that's a lousy, nasty thing to do. Um, where we're going to leave it is that France is inherently unstable in its food source. And that means it has frequent periods of starvation, and that's going to be a problem. Okay, for those of you at home, thank you for paying attention. And remember, tomorrow I'm going to enter my comments or the progress report grades. So if there's anything you haven't done yet, email it to me. Don't put it in the Google Classroom assignments because I may miss it. Email it as an attachment to me or get it in paper today or tomorrow. Thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.